Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to Odyssey 2023's fourth panel session. So today we are very happy and honored to have Dr. Maria Nolan from SOAS University of London to give us a talk about youth and the pursuit of success and well-being in urban mainland China. So the panel will include an in-depth discussion on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on young people in China. And then we will talk about the related issues demonstrated in Odyssey's opening film, Fighting Bliss, Fire and Ice. During the panel, everyone is welcome to leave their questions in the comment section. And we will also have a Q&A part at the end of the talk. Before I start introducing our guest, I want to show everyone the trailer of our opening film, Fighting Bliss.
香港都揾錢都艱，
一家幾口就咁住咗10幾平方，都已經慣晒啦。
香港覺得好多人都有啲怨氣，唔知點樣去發泄呢啲怨氣。
全球第74個最唔 happy 嘅地方，咁冰島咧應該咧都係頭3名嘅最快樂嘅國家嚟嘅。
即係我哋出發前咧，咁阿 Josie 同我哋講話，阿詹 Sir 教我哋一啲課程嘅。
Italiano Frappino得嘅 Dino 呢個練習正式開始啦嚇。Dino 話：你哋兩個開始。
好沒關係。
烘膠。你估冰島有冇嗰啲咩冰島4大才子嗰啲？
有，也不乜聲啊？有。
要係你老闆，你錯咗幾多下？識哥嘅心裏邊就哇！我頂你又我。唔能夠接受你好蠢好傻嘅呢個部分咧，你同樣都唔能夠接受你好叻好犀利嘅一個部分。
I can hear a lot more than I normally do.
Exactly. 人嘅一生嘅最終嘅價值咧，就係得到快樂。
Thank you so much for the amazing trailer. To begin with, I want to have a brief introduction of our speaker today. Dr. Maria Nolan is an anthropologist with a regional focus on mainland China. She's born and raised in Dublin, Ireland. She spent many years living and working in Beijing and other mainland Chinese cities before pursuing her doctoral research at SOAS University of London. Her research explored the emergence of zhai, which loosely refers to a tendency towards staying at home. In mainland China, a society rapidly transforming alongside innovations in digital media. Since completing her doctoral studies, Maria has conducted digital research exploring the social and psychological impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on young people in China as well as in Ireland. And also, we are very happy to have Dr. Human Chen joining today's panel. She is the founder and director of the UK-China Film Collab. Now, without further ado, I would hand over to Maria for her presentation, and then we can come back later for the Q&A part.
Thank you, Lo. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
yeah,
it's good.
Okay, firstly, I want to say it's a great pleasure to be participating as a speaker in the Odyssey Festival. It's a great honor, and I want to thank Lo in particular for inviting me to introduce my research to you today. So the title of my talk today, Youth and the Pursuit of Success and Well-being in Urban Mainland China, encapsulates a very broad topic. which I will only be able to speak about briefly within the space of this talk today. But I wanted to share with you, and actually, as I hope Lo won't mind, I will speak a little bit more about my past research project, so my pre-pandemic research, because it's heavily linked to the research that I conducted during COVID, and it's also a bigger project. I will speak a little bit about my other projects a little bit later. And this title is quite effective in bringing the research projects together. They're all concerned with young people in mainland China and in mainland Chinese cities, and how they navigate their worlds, how they deal with coming of age in education and work environments that are often described as pressurized and competitive, and how they seek respite, where they find spaces of respite from these pressurized environments. But first, I'll go back a little bit and tell you about how I came to be interested in this topic of research. I took my first trip to China in 2008. I had completed a degree in psychology in Ireland and a degree in social anthropology here in London. And my studies had given me an interest in the relationship between mental health and well-being and culture, and what was the relationship between those two things. But I had very little practical experience of other cultures. You know, Ireland is not hugely different from England. So, and China piqued my curiosity. The Olympics were happening in Beijing that year. China was increasingly present in mainstream news and growing in importance on the world stage. And as I began to read about China, I became fascinated about the changes that were taking place there. I went to Wuhan with a very vague plan, which was to spend a few years there learning about China. As it happened, I ended up staying in China for about 7 years. During this time, I moved to Beijing. I worked as an English language teacher at various higher education institutions. And I also, during that time, came across what I felt was an interesting research proposal for further PhD research. So over the course of my years in mainland China, in Chinese cities, I witnessed the country being transformed, of course, through rapid modernization, and was intrigued by the social and psychological and emotional impacts of these changes on the people around me. I lived for most of that time in Beijing, a massive and overcrowded city where the young people I was teaching and socializing with seemed to live lives that were intensely pressured. And it was among them that I encountered, maybe it was that I thought that they were intensely pressured coming from Ireland, which is a much more slow-paced country. So this was maybe much more evident to me than it might have been to other people. But it was among these young people that I encountered the phenomenon of zhai, the zhai of Jianan Jianyu, the tendency towards staying at home. And I decided to explore what the behavior of zhai meant in this context. First of all, just a bit of background for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of zhai. It's a Chinese word that can be literally translated as residence, and refers to a tendency towards staying indoors. It emerged in the mid-2000s in mainland China. Around this time or shortly thereafter, Chinese media began to report on a trend among young Chinese of labeling themselves zhai. And alongside the expansion of the internet and digital media in China, the term zhai came to be associated with the new generation of Chinese youth who were coming of age with smartphones and who were accustomed to communicating with others online through WeChat and other social media platforms, and to seeking entertainment through online content. And the words Jianan and Jianyu emerged, referring to a male and female, respectively, who tend towards staying indoors. And as I mentioned, I encountered this term among my students and people I socialized with in Beijing it also resonated with me in some ways, being a young person in a Chinese city myself. But it was someone older than me who actually brought my attention to the term zhai. Jojo, a native of Beijing, who taught me Chinese, and who was one of the first friends I made when I moved to Beijing. One day we were sitting in a cafe and she was talking about her nephew, who was then 16 years old. And she had told me about him before, about his high grades at school, about how he spent much of his free time indoors, playing computer games, watching films online. And she told me about a trip she had taken with her brother's family to Yunnan, in which her nephew had spent most of the holiday playing games and messaging with friends on his phone. And she described him to me as a zhainan, which was my first encounter with the word zhai and zhainan, which can literally be translated as home guy in English, a kind of clumsy English translation. So that conversation took place late in 2013. But around that time, I began to encounter zhainan in some of my classes. There were female students who identified themselves as zhainu. And it seemed clear to me that zhai was something of a unique trend among young Chinese. And these additional encounters with the concept only served to heighten my curiosity about it. What did it mean to be a zhainan or zhainu? Why were these young people identifying with these particular labels? There was already some scholarship on the concept, which highlighted the origins of the term zhainan. According to this research, the term zhainan originates from the Japanese term otaku, which typically refers to males with obsessive interests, particularly in relation to ACG cultures. So zhainan is believed to have originated from the Japanese term otaku, having entered the Chinese language through popular culture and media via Taiwan. And the meaning of the word, according to this research, had undergone significant changes in the Chinese context. So while otaku has been associated with antisocial behavior in media and public discourses in Japan, the term zhai had acquired the connotation of a desirable way of identifying oneself in urban China. So, sorry. By the time I was doing this preliminary research, Chinese media was reporting an increase over time in the numbers of young people referring to themselves as zhai. In one magazine article published online in 2014, zhai individuals were described as people who rarely go out and are almost proud of that fact. These were people, according to this writer, who were dependent on the internet, who can't cope with reality. The article featured a list of characteristics of a typical zhai individual, supposedly compiled by Chinese netizens, which included preoccupation with a particular hobby, dependence on computer or internet, lack of desire to go outside, and an unwillingness to socialize with strangers and fear of doing so. And articles such as this one deepened my curiosity about this phenomenon, while also giving me some insight into how zhai was being perceived in mainstream online culture in China. It was also being problematized in Chinese media and academic literature, being associated with internet or computer game addiction. And one of the aims of my research was to look at the extent to which the behavior was considered problematic by zhai individuals themselves, as well as the people around them. So a significant amount of my research was conducted online, but I also drew on my network of friends in Beijing and in other cities. I communicated with research participants in their preferred way of communicating. There were some participants with whom I only communicated online. There were some participants who preferred not to meet me in person. Many of them did, however, And I met participants in various places, at my home or their home, or on their university campus, or in other public places, for example, shopping malls or cafes. And WeChat was super helpful, of course, in connecting me with people, and other platforms were helpful in giving me insights on topics of interest to my participants. Sorry, water break. So as anyone conducting or who has conducted academic research will know, the span of time from the initial development of a research idea to the start of a research project can often be quite long. And by the time I actually started research on the phenomenon of zhai, I found that there had been a shift in perceptions of zhai as a label. So I was in Beijing. Jojo's nephew no longer called himself a Zhainan and disliked his aunt and other relatives referring to him as zhai. Some participants who had been referred to as a Zhainan or Zhainyu by their friends or relatives seemed to reject or feel uncomfortable with the label. And one of these participants was a young professional called Divan, who I met in Beijing. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what I learned from him. I had been introduced to him by a friend, Yun Li, who was also a participant in the research and who had first met Divan only 3 or 4 months earlier. From Yun Li's perspective, Divan was a typical Zhainan and would be an ideal participant for my research project. And luckily, he was interested in participating. And one of the first things Divan said to me when we met in person was that he was not really a Zhainan. His job involved a lot of time spent in the office, he said, so he couldn't spend much time at home. It was not like his university days where he could zhai for long stretches in the dormitory, playing computer games, watching movies, chatting online with friends, or just searching for something online while his dorm mates would come and go. He couldn't be so sealed off, Bong vida, nowadays, he said. I wondered then where our mutual friend's perception of him as a zhai had come from. Why does Yun Li think you are a Zhainan? I asked him. And he said that nowadays he was particular about how he spent his free time, and that perhaps he was somewhat zhai in the sense that he liked to stay at home at weekends, spending time with family or watching films. Sometimes it felt troublesome to have to go out. He said if it was arranged socializing with friends, then fine. But if he had a choice, generally he would prefer to stay at home. And Divan also emphasized to me that he felt zhai was not a good word. Not only was this type of person not very active, he said, he or she also lacked openness and positivity. At the same time, it was a condition that he could relate to, he said. It was comfortable, a way of avoiding the hassle of going out. And his friend Yun Li later told me that she felt Divan is not a traditional Zhainan, a Zhainan of the type that people would consider to be very extreme. He was not the sort of person, she said, who wanted to escape. So over the course of the initial stage of my research, I found that participants, whether they described themselves as zhai or not, generally reported feeling that zhai was neither a positive nor a negative term. One participant described it simply as a personal habit, neither good nor bad. For another, it was a way of life, which that participant was content with. However, it was clear to me that these terms, Zhainan and Zhainyu, had lost their popularity as terms for describing oneself. Zhai had become deflated as an identity label. And at this point of my research, while I was concerned that my research project was falling apart, I wondered about the behaviors associated, which seemed to linger. So, for example, zhai behaviors were evident among participants like Divan, who, while rejecting the label Jianan, acknowledged that his preferred way to spend his free time was to zhai at home. And also the word zhai, I found, was still in use among young people who would say, you know, I like to zhai at the weekend, or so forth. So at this point, some of my research questions remained. For example, what did it mean to be zhai? But the focus of my research shifted a little bit to incorporate a new question, which was, how is zhai still relevant to young people today in a world where the internet and social media are embedded in people's everyday lives? And what I found, what my thesis argued, was that zhai emerged in different spaces in young people's lives as a psychological and behavioral response to various pressures experienced by young Chinese, and was facilitated by changes in their physical and digital environments. So being online allows a person to zhai anywhere, whether it's at the dinner table, during Chinese New Year, when you're being bombarded with questions by relatives about your romantic life or your job prospects, or whether you're in a restaurant with a friend and you have an iPad with you or your mobile phone. And zhai can also be engaged in your own home, of course, finding joy in the space of playing a computer game or reading a novel. And this behavior of zhai, I argue, has become more and more mainstream as much of everyday life came to be conducted through online platforms. So coming onto my more recent research, when the COVID pandemic happened, I drew on my network of contacts in China. I was not in China at that time. I left China I was in China in December 2019, but left just before Christmas to spend Christmas with my family. And the COVID pandemic happened soon after that. And in the initial stages of the pandemic, I drew on my network of contacts in China in conducting research on the social and psychological impacts of the pandemic as it unfolded in Chinese cities. I was interested in how my participants were coping. Of course, I was connecting with some friends already on a daily basis, and who I, had people who I had deeper relationships. But some of the more zhai participants, I was wondering how they were coping. I was wondering about the differences in their daily lives as people who already spent a lot of time at home, or who already worked from home, some of them. And this research was for a project at UCL in London called Collecting COVID. So there were researchers from all over the world doing research for this project, documenting how people were dealing with COVID and with lockdowns in particular in various parts of the world. And so my little bit of research contributed to some understandings of giving people some understandings of how young people in China were dealing with the lockdowns. And some of my participants were well prepared as as people who engaged in zhai for long periods of their everyday lives. As one participant told me, now everyone knows my life. And this particular participant spent a lot of time in online gaming. He also worked from home as a music video producer. And so he experienced very little change to his daily life. Of course, this was not the case for everyone. This was also in the very initial stages of the series of lockdowns in China. And when I was conducting my research, lockdown as an experience was arguably a very different experience at this stage to the experience of lockdown later on in 2020, for example. So at the moment, I'm currently developing a project that kind of ties together these two research projects and that explores mental health among young Chinese, and in particular, young overseas Chinese students in the UK. But just to bring the discussion back to the film festival, and in particular the film Finding Bliss, which we saw a snapshot of at the beginning, I think, and I thought on watching this film that some aspects of it would really resonate with some of my participants. The idea of removing oneself from everyday social structures and social norms and social pressures is one idea that would really resonate. The idea of finding space for oneself in pressurized environments. And I also think that there's something there to do with people's relationships with material possessions. So at one point in the film, there is, we hear from one person in the film who says that everything in our house is not important. And they make the link there with the weather. And it got me thinking, yes, okay, if you know, live in an environment where everything can blow away in a storm, you don't attach that much value to material possessions. You don't get to attach to material possessions, to things that money can buy. You value other things. You value people, you value relationships. And I thought that was a really nice takeaway from the film. And I think would resonate with participants in an environment where there is a lot of pressure to obtain material possessions. So yes, okay, I'll finish up there. And I really look forward to your comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria, for your exciting presentation. And I kind of think that I resonate a lot with your research, because when I was little, I also consider myself as a zhai person. But then it gradually become a negative word, and I don't consider myself a zhai person anymore. I noticed that you do research on young generations in China, and as well as in Ireland and also in the UK. And you mentioned before, Chinese young generation is so different from that in Ireland. And I also kind of feel the same. Like when I come to the UK, I kind of have different perspectives. And so I wonder, what is the commonalities, or maybe what are the biggest difference you think that among those different places in terms of the young people there and also their social relationship?
Very interesting question. The researcher in me wants to know, what are your perceptions of young people in the UK? But I am the one who has to answer questions, so I will try to do that. I'll try to answer your question. Well, you mentioned young people being very different, and as I mentioned, you know, Ireland is a slow-paced environment, very different to the environment of Beijing. But one of the things that I found interesting over the course of doing research on zhai was that, you know, as social media platforms became more kind of embedded and everyday in people's lives, you know, this was something that was happening everywhere, right? This was happening also in Ireland and also in the UK. And so similar behaviors were emerging. You know, people were becoming more absorbed in their phones. They were, you know, interacting face-to-face less with people. These were all kind of behaviors that I was observing among zhai participants. And so I wondered why there wasn't any similar term emerging in other countries for this kind of behavior. And the conclusion I came to was that in China, it happened so fast that it was the case really that society was trying to catch up with these behaviors, so this was happening so quickly. Internet absorption in people's lives was happening so quickly that it became a starkly different behavior to the older generations, right, who grew up without the internet. So this term developed as a way to understand this new behavior of just being absorbed in online platforms. But then as it quickly spread everywhere, the term kind of lost meaning. It lost that significance among a particular group of people. It became kind of watered down. And so now that's why we don't have this subculture called zhai, because the behavior has kind of become, absorbed into mainstream culture in China. And I think that similar thing happened in Ireland. The process of embeddedness of social media was a little bit more stretched out. So it wasn't as stark in Ireland. That's my theory anyway. Does that answer your question to some extent?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I totally agree with you in terms of you were talking about everything happened so fast in China. And yeah, then this is what I feel when I was living in mainland. And I also have a question in terms of COVID-19. And I read one of your articles is about developing indifference. You highlight that indifference as the geographical and urban relation among the young generation because of rapid development in the cities and also the emergence of digital media. And during the COVID lockdown, like people spend even more time, they invest even more time at home and on digital devices. And do you think that this kind of situation has deepened young people's indifference to their surroundings, to their physical environments? And also right now, COVID has over, we don't have restrictions anymore, and people started to go outside and socialize more. Do you think that this kind of relationship between young people and their surroundings and their urban environment will eventually change?
Another great question. Yeah, so in that article, I was drawing on something I found during my research on zhai, which was, I was looking at people's attitudes towards the outside environment. If a lot of people are zhaiing at home, what are their perceptions of the outside environment? Are there factors within their physical environments that are maybe inhibiting them from spending time in them? And I kind of drew a lot on my own experience of living in Chinese cities and, finding them overcrowded and finding them ever changing as well. Sometimes you would go to a restaurant in, the other side of Beijing, and then the next time you go there, it's gone. And you just think like, what happened to that restaurant? So things are changing so quickly. And I dug into this a little bit in my PhD research, and I talked to people about how they felt about the outside environment, about how they, in what situations they would spend time in them. And I found that they would often try to minimize the time that they spent outside. They would find restaurants on apps and they would just go straight to that restaurant because it was, trending or whatever. You would plan ahead. You wouldn't just go out and wander around. And social media, of course, facilitated this very kind of micro coordination of activity, so that such that minimizes the amount of time that people spend outdoors. There were also lots of other perceptions of outdoor spaces, a lot of them kind of negative. Some of the female participants I spoke to, kind of felt like a lot of places were unsafe, or that, they wouldn't go to particular places after dark, that kind of thing. And I found all of this really interesting. And one of the other interesting things I found was that people had very little attachment to their surrounding communities. So the areas around their compounds, a lot of people seemed not to spend much time in them, apart from using them for practical purposes. All of this quite different from the environment that I grew up as well, and maybe that's why it was more noticeable to me. I think with COVID, as I mentioned, zhai behaviors kind of facilitated people's experience of staying indoors. People could fill up their days quite easily staying at home. The online delivery of products, groceries, etc., already well established in ways that it wasn't elsewhere in the world when COVID happened. But in China, those behaviors already well established, and a lot of young people were used to spending a lot of time at home. Education and work from home may be slightly different. And I think I haven't conducted research on the post-COVID environment. I suspect that COVID lockdowns brought people more into contact with their neighbors in a lot of cases, strengthened community in a lot of places in China, where people drew on their neighborhood networks in order to get things done, in order to get support. So in that sense, I think it did create more of a relationship with the outside immediate surroundings for people. And people's attachment to place is really attachment to people within places, right? It's relationships that create attachment to places. It's spending time with people in particular places that creates this attachment to places. So knowing your neighbors would facilitate in that. But I suspect that this may have been a temporary kind of shift, and that people will fall back now into their past ways of existing within their neighborhoods, in much the same way that people kind of fell back into past behaviors in other parts of the world. I think a lot of people thought that COVID and lockdowns changed behaviors for the long term. And I think this has been true in some cases, but not in many others.
Thank you so much. My next question is actually about our opening film, Finding Bliss, which we all watched in our opening ceremony. This film also discussed the high pressure of life among the young generation in Hong Kong, and to realize those kind of, to release those kind of pressure in life and work. The movie has documented a group of young musicians and their trip to Iceland to pursue happiness. So my question is that, do you think the kind of loose connection between the Chinese young generation and their cities will lead to more people try to run away from their original environment, maybe their cities and maybe their countries, to pursue happiness or maybe success overseas or in other places?
So when you say run away, you mean, move permanently, or?
It depends. It's similar to zhai, like run right now is a kind of a popular word, a popular term in China. It means that it can be used of like running away from an unhealthy environment. Like people will say, I want to run away from my job, or maybe they will say, I want to run away from my maybe my home country. So I wonder if you would ever notice this term, and what is your interpretation of this phenomenon?
Well, yeah, I think there are degrees of running away, you know, and I think zhai is one aspect of it. You can see, you know, in the way that participant I spoke of said, you know, I don't want to seal myself off completely. So there is a sense that zhai is a kind of insulating behavior. It's a way of like separating yourself from an environment that creates a kind of pressure. And I think in situations where perhaps people don't have a choice, they have family obligations, they have educational obligations, work obligations, etc. They may have the desire to move elsewhere. And I certainly talked to some participants who were concerned about pollution in their city, you know, and how they would like to move to another place where you know, with better air or whatever. But it came down to individual circumstances and you know, particular personal choices that people had. And zhai was one way of separating oneself from a challenging environment. I mean, those participants I spoke to who were concerned about the air pollution, they interpreted zhai as a way of simply just staying at home, like not going out, staying at home with their air purifiers. That was what zhai meant to them. But for other people, zhai was a way of coping with family pressures. So they spoke about how they would zhai when they went home to their parents' house and faced uncomfortable conversations about what they had and had not accomplished so far in their lives. And so zhai meant very different things to different people. But I do think that is one way of creating, maybe not running away essentially, but creating some space around yourself as a kind of buffer from things that stress you out.
Thank you so much for your sharing. And I wonder if Human, do you have any questions to Maria?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for sharing. I guess from the film perspective, that we are interested in what kind of film do you think that will help driving the young people to go out again, to not to be too zhai again after COVID. I see that maybe may I share another trailer, Lou? Just another film that we're showing at the festival at the moment called Ode to the Spring. I just noticed that the UK distributor Cedric is also here, so I just thought maybe we'll share it quickly. Yeah. So it's also another COVID in China, how people trying to cope afterwards, and I think maybe it's quite good to compare to the previous one. Just give 1 minute. Share it.
别怕，我一定要见到你。
我做了一个很长的梦，梦见了咱们去过的那片海。
我们现在就去。
小雨，你现在能看见大海了。
舅舅，这情况可比咱想象的严重多了吧？
那你也不能见死不救啊！
大夫乱说。妈妈前武汉大病毒了，现在屋头只剩我们两爷子。
妈妈，你怎么？
哎呀！
妈妈，我想你了。爷爷奶奶明明给我们拿了一些发和香肠的，他还给我吃方便面。哎呀，慢慢慢，别来下糖啊！
大家要相信我们，我们会尽所能为大家服务。
这么听见了？
加油！
让你们回去！
无所谓有医治嘛，是不是？我们只要有口气的，就有希望。
我想高，我想成。
加油！
春天来了，趁春天，
趁春天，
我们见面吧。
So I guess my question is that this is for everyone as well. What kind of films do you think that can encourage young people to go out from their home and go to the cinema and to be social again? And what kind of film can give them new direction and inspiration to be part of the social life again, from your perspective? Yes.
This for me? Wow. Well, thank you for showing that trailer. It looks super interesting and made me want to watch it myself. I think that I can imagine that this would be a very emotional experience for especially the young people in Wuhan. I suppose any person living in Wuhan, having gone through what they went through at the beginning of the pandemic. I wanted to speak to some friends in Wuhan at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was too difficult for them to talk about their experiences. And I think for quite a few people, they wanted as quickly as possible to move on from memories of the pandemic. But also, as time goes on, now that we move past and into a post-COVID era, I think films like this would really resonate, especially with young people who, have so many responsibilities on their shoulders and just went through a really difficult time during that period. And I think films like that that resonate with their everyday lives and pressures would really resonate with them.
Yeah, thank you. I think from the industry perspective, I guess maybe Cedric has something to say as well. It's very difficult to get people to go back to the cinema now, not just in China, the young people. I guess maybe they're doing better now in China, but in the UK, everyone is very comfortable at home and no one goes to the cinema anymore. So it's very difficult to drive people to go out and get out from the comfort zone. Streaming, I guess that's beyond the Chinese community as well. So Ode to the Spring is actually about Wuhan during the lockdown and what people do at home, and it's about the daily life during the lockdown. It's quite interesting. It's currently still showing at the festival. Maybe we can arrange a screening for you as well, a link.
Oh, please, that would be great.
It's quite relevant to what we discussed today as well. So what do you think the next phase is? Let's say that zhai is kind of like, in the past few years, a new trend.
Sorry, I just wanted to, if I may, can I speak?
Yeah.
Hi. Hi, well, thank you very much. I wanted to say thank you for this very interesting talk. Panel, Maria, is very interesting area of research that you're doing. I just wanted to say a few words about the film, because since you played the trailer and you mentioned it, it's a film that really failed to connect with the audience at the time, and I think it was too early for this film, because the film initial release in China was planned just when the lockdowns actually started, quite ironically. So it was a celebration of victory against COVID, but it was released right in the middle of the battle with COVID in China, which, as we know, didn't really start. The second battle, which didn't start until spring 2022. So I think it was really the wrong timing, and no one wanted to see that. No one wanted to engage with that at the time. But looking back a year later, and as I said, 2 years later, 3 years later, I think it'll be quite an interesting film to as a sort of recording of daily lives, because the film is actually based on a lot of research. It's not just set in Wuhan. It's different stories. One of them is set in Wuhan, but actually a short one. But it's really about how people's lives changed and how they had to make adjustments, different level, from the front line in Wuhan to people being stranded at home without their loved ones, as we experienced here. But it's interesting that I think now, and from then and still now, no one really wants to talk about COVID, right? It's something we've just experienced and lived, and it's behind us. And we just want to forget about it. But I think we will come back to it and see this time as a, I mean, there have been films about COVID already, and they have been released pretty much in the aftermath, but we've moved on from that immediate reflection that we needed right after the event. Now we just want to live our life and pretend it didn't happen until the next one comes, or until it's time again to reassess that. But I think it highlights also a difficulty, which is, yes, how do you because in China, lots of films are made about people's lives, I think, but they don't necessarily want to engage with that on the screen. Same as here. I think everywhere around the world, cinema is about big screen experience, and it's about what do you have to experience on screen. But so it's only sort of like tentpole films that really drive people to the cinema. But interestingly, there was a phenomenon that we've seen in certain countries, and especially in Hong Kong, I think, where they probably had it, the toughest, or one of the toughest, where last year for Hong Kong cinema was one of the best years that they ever had for homegrown films. And, and if you look at what these films are, they are really films about communion, about people being together again, about family, about sitting down together for a meal, about sharing moments together. And this sense of togetherness, I think, was needed on the screen and in the cinema. And what you saw on the screen was a real reflection of people's needs. So that was amazing to see. But unfortunately, it looks like it only lasted 1 year. It's back to normal, and no one has that need anymore. But we shall see. But I think it's quite interesting how cinema can, of course, unite people in a room together, especially people, as you say, who have gotten used to being alone at home behind the screen. And I think cinema definitely has a function there, and there's a need for it. It's just that it's become more difficult to drive people to that space.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think that people would be interested in films about communion and being together in mainland China, having gone through what people have gone through over the last few years. But also, I think, engaging with the world outside of China as well, I think is something that would resonate with people who are only now able to travel, having been confined for so long. I think that is something that also, I think, there's a lot of conversations now about how we need to have better interaction between China and other countries. There needs to be more interaction between China and the West. And I think this would also, if it was reflected in film somehow, be of interest, not only of interest to Chinese people, but also people outside China.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, there's, I'm not sure how much time we have here. I don't want to hijack the conversation, but there's definitely a tremendous appetite to travel and to see films from abroad in China. There's definitely that I can really see it. I think they've been starved of and there was a real worry, and my interaction with people who were in China, they were sort of very getting, looking through being in a tunnel and not seeing the light at the end of it, not, despairing when they'd be able to travel and engage with the world again, and suddenly just opened. And now I think it's really the floodgates have been opened and everyone's out. And I think that's, so it's going to be a very rich period right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions and amazing answers. I wonder if anyone in the audience still want to ask questions to our guest? Hi, Xinyi. Sorry, I think you muted yourself.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry. So I'm a first year PhD student at King's College London, and my major is Chinese study, and I work on a project called Lying Flat, 躺平. So it kind of your project of zhai kind of remind me of like my project, and I kind of wonder, have you ever come across these lying flat things? And since you have mentioned that you think zhai is typically happening in China is because everything is happening so fast in China, and but I have come across the other like phenomenon here, like the gobbling mode, quiet quitting, and the big resignation in this so-called Western society. So I kind of wondering if you think they are having some similarities like among them, and I am also wondering, do your research is mainly focused from a social perspective, or you also having some economic or politics engagement? I think that's my question.
Yeah, I've very interested in this this slightly newer concept of tangping, and I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of these concepts. Tangping, I think, is probably more related to work and education, whereas zhai is maybe a slightly broader concept. But I would imagine that they are both kind of responses to pressurized competitive environments. As to whether it is similar in terms of similar phenomena elsewhere, I think, only research can really answer that question. I wanted to look at otaku as well, and look at the differences between otaku and zhai, but of course I would have needed to go to Japan and study otaku there to make that comparison. I would imagine that there are some links for sure, and if you're looking at perhaps doing a comparative study, I think that would be a really interesting way to go, or even looking at whether tangping exists among Chinese outside of China. That was something I was interested in looking at when I was looking at zhai. And interestingly, I found that zhai behavior existed, but people didn't necessarily talk about zhai as a way to describe themselves while they were in other contexts. And so you might find that also if you were to do the same with tangping. But I look forward to reading your research on it.
Well, thank you very much, but I'm still very at the very beginning of my study. But I have another very minor question about, since you mentioned that your study is mainly focused on the young people, and but you also mentioned that it's becoming more mainstream phenomenon. So I wonder, are you looking into a typical age groups, or you just refer the youth to a more self-identity things, or not a very typical age groups?
Well, what I found was that it was initially young people's associated with young people. Older people didn't really have much awareness of the term initially when I first encountered it. And I think it very much remains a kind of post-80s and to some extent post-90s phenomenon. But I think with social media, it has spread to other age groups, who also engage in digital media and find more reasons to stay at home. So yeah, not specific to young people.
Thank you so much for the question and answer. Do we still have other questions from the audience?
Hi, Maria. Hi,
Hi.
Maria. Yeah, I'm Reina, and I feel really connected with the topic of zhai.
At first, I was very happy to like identify myself as a zhai, but with the shift of the perception of zhai, like I feel annoyed when my parents called me a zhai. So in recent years, like there is a trend in China, young people take a personality test called MBTI, and one trait of this personality test shows how we interact with our environment, and it describes you as introverted or extroverted. And I think the idea of introverted is very similar with the idea of zhai, but like unlike zhai, Chinese young people feel very comfortable and like happy to identify themselves as introverted person. Like, how do you think about this change?
Yeah, I certainly met a lot of introverted people when I did this research, and I wondered about that myself, actually. But as anthropologists, we're less interested in psychological constructs like introversion, extroversion. But it was an interesting sort of reflection. I think that, well, my understanding of why people would be happier to label themselves introverted or to be called introverted than they would to be called zhai is, I think, connected with how zhai has been depicted and talked about in mainstream online culture and media in China. I think it was discussed negatively initially as a behavioral problem. So, you know, as we often hear about in Chinese media, you know, a youth problem. So it became described as a kind of youth problem to do with addiction to internet and computer games and the like. I also think it kind of it depicts a sort of, it has come to depict a sort of person who is anti-social in some way. And, you know, that is, of course, going to be a negative thing, right? So it's about connecting with the society and not connecting with the society, whereas introversion is something that is specifically about the personality of the person, right? It's not about your relationship with your surroundings or society, which should be positive. Introversion is something that's less to do with your social environment.
Oh, okay, thank you for your answer.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria, for giving us such a wonderful talk and sharing your insightful thoughts. And I hope many of us will find what you have said very inspiring. And I hope that we can have a further discussion next time. But unfortunately, I think that our time is up, so I must draw this in a close. And thank you once again, Maria, and also Human, and everyone who attend the panel. And hopefully I will see everyone soon.
Thank you so much. And thank you for introducing me to that film, which I'm going to follow up on. And thank you for the interesting questions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Maria. We'll send you a link.
Oh, thank you.
Bye.
Okay, see ya.
Bye-bye.